I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 5 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 3, the committee is meeting in public on the actions of the longest ballot committee in recent Canadian elections. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I would ask that all in-person participants consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card, which links to a short awareness video. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of members. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. My apologies for that. Just as a housekeeping note, the Subcommittee on Private Members' Business is meeting in the room at 1:15, so I will be fairly strict in our ending of this meeting at 1 o'clock. I would like to welcome our witnesses for today's first panel. As an individual, Peter Lowen, Harold Tanner, Dean of the College of Arts and Science, Cornell University, by video conference, and Mr. Tomas Shukevich, who is the official agent for the longest ballot committee. Each witness will have 5 minutes to deliver opening remarks, and then we'll proceed with questions and answers. First, we will go to Mr. Lowen for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much to the committee for this invitation. I've now appeared before this committee, I believe, a half dozen times over a 20-year period, and it's always been an honor to do so. And I'm pleased today to share with you my thoughts on the question of long ballots. I understand the issue in the following way. It's relatively easy to get one's name on the ballot in Canada. Because of this, a group of Canadians who object to our electoral system decided they would demonstrate their dissatisfaction with our form of electoral democracy by adding as many people as possible to ballots in high-profile races. In the submission by that group today, they appeal to a slightly more general and unobjectionable point, that MPs should not write their own rules of election. That point has merits, and I will return to it. But their larger point is that Canada's electoral system should be reformed, and they'll keep making ballots longer until Canadians get the message. Our electoral system has not changed, but voters in a small number of constituencies have been forced to search for competitive, sincere candidates among dozens or hundreds of names of insincere candidates. Should members of Parliament be changing the Canada Elections Act to respond to this? Let me make 2 arguments why you should, and 2 why you should not, and then say something quickly about the history of monkey business on our ballots. Why should you make it harder for names to enter our ballot? First, these long ballot efforts clearly, in practice, violate the spirit of our competitive elections. Elections should be contested between people with real intentions of entering Parliament, who have mustered some minimum level of local support through signatures, unique signatures, and who are ready to actively compete against others. The ballot is much more than a petition, and so it should require more than shenanigans to get on it. Second, the management of our elections is highly localized. It depends on volunteers and minimally paid part-time workers to carry out manning polling stations, assisting voters in understanding the ballot, and then in counting votes. Smooth conduct of elections and the rapid counting of constituency races is what Canadians expect. Excessively long ballots, however funny they might be, make it harder for voters to cast a vote and harder for local servants of our democracy to count ballots. Canada's reputation of well-run elections is hard-earned and well-deserved. It's not funny to monkey with this. For these reasons, making it harder for unserious candidates to get on a ballot is a good idea. What are the arguments against changing these rules? First, you are in an interesting conflict of interest in that you can all benefit as incumbents from certain rule changes. Thus, changes to electoral rules, should be done carefully, transparently, and with as much consensus and outside validation as possible. Second, the effects of these long ballots are probably quite small, so this may not be a high priority issue. But if you have chosen to deal with it, so be it. Just do so transparently and respecting of the public's concerns about a conflict of interest. One final point, Canada has a history of monkey business on ballots, some funny, some not. In its heyday, the Rhinoceros Party, which you might recall used to field a lot of candidates, would do funny things like have a platform plank of an angled bike path across the country so one could coast from coast to coast. Very good, very funny. There are less funny examples. As Louis Massicotte once told me, in Quebec, before the introduction of party names on ballots, troublemakers would occasionally run a candidate who shared a name with a serious candidate. This was meant to confuse voters. That's less funny. This long ballot business is less funny. It's the handiwork of self-proclaimed democratic reformers who have lost referendum after referendum, sometimes after citizens' assemblies and sometimes not, and who recently lost another court case affirming the constitutionality of our electoral system. Canadians have, time and again, indicated that they don't want what they're selling. So you might find it less funny that they want free rein to gum up election ballots. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For 5 minutes, we'll turn to Mr. Shukevich.
Okay, members of PROC, given your mandate of reviewing both election law and conflicts of interest, it is extremely wise of you to take the time to investigate what the longest ballot committee is all about. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my appearance today, it's that democracy is best managed with strict, nonpartisan impartiality. So while you consider that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to give a huge thank you to all the candidates who put their names forward to run in long ballots. And I want to give a huge thank you to all the voters who signed their names hundreds of times in support of those candidates and in support of electoral reform. Because of them, this protest has been successful beyond anything I honestly could have ever imagined. And now, clearly, we have the attention of politicians. Because I've been invited to Parliament today because they hear our message. They hear our shared desire for improving democracy. So I want to start with praise for two Canadian institutions. Elections Canada is admired for its professionalism and independence. We voters know that we are able to cast our votes and that everyone running the polling station is impartial and our votes will be counted fairly. Elections Canada is actually one of the most trusted government institutions in our nation, and that trust is deserved. Elections Canada is trusted precisely because it is nonpartisan and independent. The same is true of our electoral boundary commissions. In many places around the world, politicians actually decide their own districts. And what do? They gerrymander maps to try to lock in their own power. Canada wisely does not tolerate that. Instead, boundary drawing is the responsibility of independent commissions operating at arm's length from Parliament. So here's the problem. While ballot counting and boundary drawing are correctly protected from political interference, the rules of our election are not. The laws that govern how parties are regulated, how ballots are designed, about who's even allowed to put their name forward as a candidate, and about how votes get translated into seats. These laws are all still written and modified by you, MPs, with your partisan interests and with your careers actually depending on the outcome of each election. This is a textbook conflict of interest, obviously. The longest ballot committee advocates that you MPs recuse yourselves from writing the rules of your own elections. We already know that the model of nonpartisan independence works. Canadians would be well served by a permanent, independent, nonpartisan body to oversee the full framework of election law. This reform would also protect you as MPs. When you propose changes to election law, you are often met with suspicion, and rightly so. Even good reforms can be dismissed as self-serving when they are written by people who are perceived to benefit from the changes. By handing responsibility to an independent, nonpartisan body, voters could finally trust that the laws were written to serve the best interests of Canadians, rather than to serve the best interests of the ruling parties. The longest ballot committee is urging MPs to do the right thing and recuse yourselves from this blatant conflict of interest and establish a permanent, independent, nonpartisan body to oversee the full framework of election law. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you to both witnesses for being under your 5-minute allotment. Mr. Cooper, we'll turn to you for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shukevich, you have operated as a key organizer for the longest ballot committee and served as the official agent for many of the candidates affiliated with the longest ballot committee, correct?
That is correct.
And your brother, Kieran Shukevich, also is an organizer with the Longest Ballot Committee, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and I want to ask you some questions about the recruitment of candidates and the collection of nomination signatures for the Longest Ballot Committee. When you and other organizers from the Longest Ballot Committee were collecting signatures, at times electors would have been presented with multiple nomination forms to sign simultaneously.
That's correct.
Okay. And as you went about collecting signatures and recruiting candidates, the Longest Ballot Committee told prospective candidates that they didn't have to worry about collecting signatures because the Longest Ballot Committee already had collected the 100 or more signatures needed for them to get onto the ballot. Isn't that true?
No, that's not true. You have that a little bit backwards. So we recruit candidates, we get all their names, and then we collect signatures for them. We're not like just collecting signatures for people who said they don't want to run.
So I have a video
Okay.
that you posted on YouTube to the Longest Ballot Committee on August 18th, 2024, in respect of the LaSalle-Imard-Verdun by-election, in which you state that if we're going to break the record for the longest ballot, we need everyone to sign up as soon as possible. We've already collected 100 nomination signatures for you. All you have to do is follow the instructions. So, in fact, you and other organizers for the Longest Ballot Committee were going around with nomination forms that didn't have candidates' names on them. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct.
I'm going to stop you there, Mr. Shukevich, because I have a tweet that was posted by the Longest Ballot Committee on January 22nd, 2024, of you, of Kieran, and of I believe, a Glenn McDonald.
Yep.
And when you look more closely, this is you, we see where the candidate's name is on the nomination form with signatures. The candidate's name is blank. So that's precisely what you were doing, was going out and collecting signatures, getting electors to sign blank nomination forms, not candidate nomination forms.
That is not accurate.
Well, I just present you with evidence, documentary evidence, that establishes that, in fact, it is accurate. And I want to caution you, sir, but you're testifying before a parliamentary committee, and you have an obligation to answer my questions fully and truthfully. And if you fail to do so, sir, you can be held in contempt of Parliament. And I want to make clear to you that I will not hesitate in using all of the tools available to hold you accountable should you not provide truthful and accurate answers, which up till now you have not. So I'm going to give you one last opportunity to confirm on the record that you went about collecting signatures from electors where the candidate's name was blank. That's what you did, right?
No, that is not accurate. If you would give me a chance to actually respond, you've made quite a few incorrect assumptions here. Where would you like me to begin? With the AI doctored images or with your misunderstanding of what sign up means? So in that video, when I say sign up, what I'm referring to is that these are candidates who have already expressed that they want to run. We then collected their signatures with the candidate name at the top. Obviously, that's the rule.
It's not at the top.
It was at the top. I was there.
It was not at the top.
And then when we say we already have your signatures, you need to finish signing up, that is referring to fill out your forms, book an appointment with the returning officer to do your declaration. This is very straightforward. You have it kind of mixed up. If you want to talk about those AI manipulated photos, I'm happy to do so.
I don't have anything mixed up. What I have are
respectfully, you do have that mixed up.
A YouTube video.
If I can for a moment, Mr. Shukevich.
Yeah.
We operate here on a position that members of Parliament are honourable, and to accuse a member of Parliament of doctoring images, I think you should tread very carefully in that. I don't know about these images, but I'm giving you a warning in terms of, I don't find it funny, sir. I don't think you should find it funny either. Mr. Cooper is correct in what Parliament can do, and perhaps you don't have respect for the individuals sitting at these chairs. Please have respect for the institution and the electors that put us here. Sorry, Mr. Cooper. I think we stopped about 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, we have never collected signatures with blank candidate names. The Chief Electoral Officer has already testified to you that there's no credible evidence of any
wrongdoing. Chief Electoral Officer in his testimony said that your committee initially got caught doing precisely just that. That was his testimony.
Respectfully, Mr. Chair, that it was not his testimony. His testimony was that we collected without an identified candidate, which is true. We wrote all candidates were in the candidate field, and we got people to sign. We said, would you be willing to nominate any and all candidates?
That's what you did. You just admitted it.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. Lewis for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you to both the witnesses for being here today. Professor Lowen, I'm going to start my questions with you. Ultimately, we're talking about protecting democracy, protecting our elections, which is something that's very important. So I know that you've done work with, as a professor in the Department of Government at Cornell, and also you've done work with the Canadian Election Misinformation Project. And I wondered if you can expand on how AI can be weaponized to distort democratic discourse. Do you believe that Canada's current legal framework is sufficient to address the risks proposed by AI-generated disinformation, misinformation during elections? And what specific reforms would you have in mind?
Thanks very much for asking, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate the question very much. Let me just give you a quick insight, which is that Canadian election law has, and I spoke with this actually with the committee in November, so it's quite nice to revisit it. Canadian election law has over time restricted how much can be done by so-called third parties to participate in our elections. So we're talking about advocacy groups or unions or business associations to advertise and be active during political campaigns. The reason why we've done that is because we've sort of come to believe that political parties should be the principal vehicles through which our elections are contested. And this longest ballot committee is actually an interesting example of a group that's acting like a third party or maybe like a political party, but not putting itself into that regulatory framework. So that's something for you to consider. But on the issue of AI and misinformation, I'll just give you the following intuition, perhaps. We regulate the participation of third parties through two things. One is we regulate how much they can spend as a way of trying to limit how much they can speak. So there are very strict spending limits on which individuals or how much third parties can spend and thus engage in speech. And the second thing we regulate is we regulate individuals. So we make individual humans legally responsible for what third parties do. The challenge with artificial intelligence is that it can bring the cost of communication down to zero. So the spending mechanism limit on third parties isn't as effective when the cost of doing something is approaching zero. That's problem one. And problem two is what you might call the agentic problem, that we're not far away from people effectively creating non-human agents who will perpetuate speech during elections. Fake Twitter accounts are one example of this, but you can imagine an AI agent that's designed to create political advertisements and then put them out onto the web. It's not an individual putting them on, it's an autonomous agent, and it's doing it at essentially zero cost as it uses social media to spread itself. So what's needed in the legislative framework to address that is to acknowledge that the kind of human-centered spending limit approach to limiting third parties doesn't work as well potentially in an AI world. I hope that's helpful to you.
It is, thank you. And is there a way then to require, let's say, labeling AI-generated content, possibly during election time? Can that be enforced without stifling legitimate political expression? Is there a way of doing that and balancing that during an election campaign?
There is, I think. I mean, I would say that you already have labeling of political ads, right? So the way Elections Canada's legal framework works, or the way the Canada Elections Act framework works when we're regulating speech during elections, is parties have to take accountability for the ads they put in place by indicating that they've been approved by the agent of the party. And third parties who are operating within the law also have to disclose who's behind the advertisement, and they have to subject themselves to limits. So, and the way you do that is you do make the broadcasters and the platforms comply with certain restrictions when labeled content is put out, right? And with the requirement to not post unlabeled content that is an election advertisement. So you can extend that part of it, I think, relatively easily. And then the second thing you can do is you could pass legislation that would similarly prohibit the platforms and the networks from disseminating information which looks like election advertising by third parties, even if it is produced by agents rather than by humans.
Thank you. In the time I have left, in your opening statement, sir, you referred to the longest ballot as in the fact that management of elections are highly localized, and the concern that I have on this committee is the rights of people to vote. Can you explain that point, that the management of election highly localized, and the challenges that were faced, and the possible challenges to people's right to vote?
Yes. What's remarkable about Canadian elections is how amateur they are and how well run they are, right? That all of our local polling places are staffed by people who are paid, but they're essentially temporary people working to serve our democracy. And they're doing it in kind of the most important civic activity that we do. So I've always found that kind of interesting. But the challenge is that if voters walk into a polling place and they're confronted by 1,000 names on a ballot or 200 names on a ballot, it makes it challenging for election workers to explain the ballot to them, and it makes it challenging for them to help the voters do what the voters intend to do. Voters are not there to cast a ballot for some obscure person who got onto the ballot through a signature harvesting exercise. They're there to vote for one of the major parties, or maybe a real independent local candidate or a local notable, or a small party that's trying to break through. So if voters are going there and they're told, look, voting is straightforward, trust us that you can do this, and suddenly they're confronted with a meter-long ballot, it erodes, at least at the margin, their sense of democratic efficacy, and it makes it hard for the people running elections. I'm sure it's frustrating to explain where to look for the people who are actually running for office on that ballot.
Interject, I do apologize. Mr. Lewis is over time. Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, and yes, if you can put in your earpiece.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to both the witnesses. Professor, let me start with asking questions of you. In your opening remarks, you started by saying that the longest ballot committee is violating the spirit of the elections a tad. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the balance that should be struck between the right of an individual to run and also to run on their ideas, by extension, and the right of citizens to have elections, the spirit of which is to elect someone who would be fit to represent them. So how do you strike that fine balance between the right to run, to bring your ideas to the fore, and also to have elections, the spirit of which is laudable and praiseworthy?
I think the ballots in Canada... Pardon me. Okay, are we okay? I think ballots in Canada most certainly should have a place for non-major party candidates, right? And I think that it's really wonderful that people step up to run in elections when they probably know that they don't actually have much of a chance of winning, depending on their party and their geography of where they are. And I think that is an important part of our democratic exercise. Those are sincere people, and other people will often step forward because they're animated by some issue that really matters to them, and they want to express that issue. That's different than people who are not running to be a contestant in the election as their principal motivator, but who are instead running, really adding their name to the ballot because they want to make a larger point. And I think that is the animating spirit of the longest ballot committee. They want to gum up the ballot with as many names as possible to make a point that's different than standing in an election because you have certain views. So I think you can certainly strike a legislative sweet spot, which makes it possible for local people who want to run for the sake of running, even if they're not a part of a major party, to get on that ballot by earnestly seeking a large number of signatures while tailoring the rules to not allow for the monkeying of ballots by allowing, for example, one individual or one group to capture signatures for hundreds of people.
Merci. Et j'ai envie d'aller justement...
Thank you. I'd just like to drill down on that issue of striking a balance that you just alluded to, the difference between bringing to the fore ideas and using the ballot as a pressure tactic. Now, you referred to the fact that there might be less serious candidates in any given election. I might for example, think of the Rhinoceros Party that presents kind of far-fetched ideas and, in fact, are a protest candidate in some ways. It's a way of casting a donkey vote. So how can one judge what is kind of a little bit funny and what is actually unacceptable and egregious in the context of an election?
I think it's a great question, and I think, like many things, you know it when you see it. So let's contrast the Rhinoceros Party in its heyday with what's going on here. The Rhinoceros Party would run candidates across the whole country. They would do the work of getting a single candidate on the ballot. Then they would put out a platform which was rather satirical and funny, putting up a wall to keep killer bees from coming from the United States, or removing the Rocky Mountains so you could coast from coast to coast on a bicycle. All these ideas are funny, and I don't think that they ever impaired the ability of other voters to cast ballots to find their candidates. But this is something different. This is not even about the idea of elections. This is a committee which believes that we should have a different electoral system, despite constant demonstrations that Canadians don't want that, and constitutional affirmations that our electoral system is democratic. And because they're not getting it, they've decided to essentially gum up our electoral system at the level of the ballot. So I guess part of the distinction here is that it's having a material cost on how ballots are designed and experienced, and it's not actually about the election, is it? It's not actually about making fun of the process of whatever election we're in or some particular issue. It's about gumming up the process, and that just strikes me as perhaps something different than being a satirical candidate out to get a laugh.
Justement, considérant que l'idée...
Considering that the idea being floated by the longest ballot committee is to have electoral overhaul, could one, for example, create a party for electoral reform and run or field a number of candidates in certain ridings for the 45th Parliament, for example?
That's a great party platform to run on if you think it's an important issue that will then be taken up in Parliament. I don't think you'll win, but sure, someone could try to start that party.
Et à ce moment-là, est-ce que ce serait une façon peut-être...
So, in that sense, would that be a good way of taking the pulse of the public to see what demand there is for electoral overhaul and how well such a party could perform? Given that the general public really doesn't have a real sense of the views that are being touted by the largest ballot committee.
Yeah, I think if a party wants to test a single issue, an election is one way to do it. And if a party wanted to run purely on electoral reform, they could give it a go. It would certainly be a more sincere effort than this one.
Jackson, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to confirm with you, Mr. Shukevich, in your submission to the committee, it said that whoever wrote the submission, I'm not sure if that was you, said that they watched the testimony from the Chief Electoral Officer last week. So just wanting to confirm if that was you that authored that document or not, and did you watch the Chief Electoral Officer's testimony last week?
Yeah, my brother and I wrote that document. And yeah, I watched the testimony last week.
Okay. So you'll have seen then that the Chief Electoral Officer testified last week that your actions in various constituencies, whether it be general or by-election, affect every voter's access to vote, but the actions of your organization particularly hurt and block the ability of seniors and folks with disabilities to be able to cast their ballot. Those who are born with additional needs and the seniors who built this country should not have barriers put in their way by a political stunt that has no motivation or request from the public to change our electoral system. So what kind of an organization would try to prevent those most vulnerable in our society and our seniors from being able to access their constitutional right to vote?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that's a great question. So as we all know, the design of federal ballots is prescribed by the Election Act, which is written by you MPs. So I'm not aware of any documented cases of people actually being prevented from voting because of too many candidates. I am aware of existing accessibility concerns surrounding the voting process. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind gave a series of recommendations to this very committee on improving accessibility when Bill C-65 was being discussed. I would point out that none of their recommendations have been implemented by you, and I would also point out that none of their recommendations involved arbitrarily restricting citizens' rights to run as a candidate. So I'm not an expert on accessible ballot design, so I would suggest that you talk to the disability advocates for that.
Well, thank you, Chair. I think the Chief Electoral Officer has spoken to disability advocates and has heard multiple complaints. The number of complaints about this election were higher than it has been before, which was also presented as part of his testimony. So whether or not it's the end goal of your organization, this is the result that people had a more difficult time casting their ballot in this election, both in the Battle River Crowfoot by-election and in the general election, than ever before. And they were predominantly seniors who had to wait in longer lines and found the sometimes meter-long ballot more inaccessible, or people with disabilities, including, as you mentioned, people that are vision impaired. So these actions have caused people not only to be unable to wait in the line longer to vote, but also required in many cases no longer their ability to privately vote because they required assistance in the ballot box in order to manage the ballot that your organization forced to be so unwieldy that they could not manage it on their own. Why would you take these actions? And what do you have to say to those Canadians who had their privacy breached because of their inability to manage the ballot on their own because of your campaign's actions?
Mr. Speaker, I don't design the ballots. The ballot design is written in the Elections Act, which means you MPs actually design the ballot. And if the Chief Electoral Officer was following the will of Parliament, then it actually would have been twice as long in those two-column situations. Of course, for operational reasons, understandably, he had to make emergency amendments to the Elections Act in order to not make it like 4 meters long. So yeah, if you're concerned about accessible ballot design, I strongly suggest you talk to disability advocates because I'm not an expert on this, and I have no power to change the design of the ballot.
Well, sir, with respect, you do have the ability to stop your committee's actions from blowing up our ballots to achieve a political goal where there is no political consensus in this country to change our electoral system. The professor's already noted it. You have a Liberal Party that campaigned on it in 2015 and then backed away from it because they recognized that there was no willingness to change the electoral system from anywhere near a consensus or even close to a majority of Canadians. So you're wasting everybody's time and in the process harming some of our most vulnerable Canadians' ability to participate in Canada's democracy.
Okay, I will interject there as it is 5 minutes. Perhaps Mr. Shukevich, you can answer that in subsequent questions that may come up. So we will move along to Madame Kayabaga, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Just a question for Dr. Lowen. do you think that there are any empirical studies in Canada or anywhere else in the world that show that the ballot length affects voter error rates, any spoilage, or even like voter turnout, and including the ability for voters to understand the ballot and how that impacts or doesn't impact their decision making?
Thank you for asking. It's a literature I used to know better about 15 or 20 years ago. So I don't want to characterize all of it, but I'll just say two things about it. One is that ballot design effects are generally small. So very rarely do ballot design effects matter for the outcome of an election. So I think we should be clear about that. There are, however, a few notable irregularities. One is that ballots that are alphabetically ordered favor people who are at the top of the ballot, and there's fairly well established empirics on ballot order mattering. So people who are closer to the top of a ballot matter more, and then length of ballot is thought to increase those effects, because the longer a ballot is, the more likely you might be to just sort of say, "Oh, come on, this is too much. I'll just go for someone near the top." That said, a lot of that comes out of studies in the United States where you've got a lot of different offices that you're voting for at once, for example. The most, of course, notable case, right, was that there's pretty good empirical evidence that in Palm Beach County in 2000, Al Gore or Pat Buchanan won that county because of the ballot design, and they had a so-called butterfly ballot, which opened up like this, and it was unclear which person you were voting for on which side of the ledger, which is kind of a famous example of how a ballot design can lead to unintended effects. But the long story short is, I think the effects of this would be small, but the frustration for voters could be real in having to confront a ballot of hundreds of names, which we've never really seen before in Canada.
And just a quick question on that. What kind of reforms do you think would sort of bear the lengthy ballots, especially if they're impeding someone's right to vote and to understand the ballot and the kind of impacts that they may have on that decision making?
I think the tension you have here in designing the legislation is how high of a bar do you set that makes this kind of gumming up the ballot very difficult, but yet is not too high that a sincere candidate who may not have the backing of a party, or who may have the backing of a party that's not popular in that part of the country, can still get over that bar. I will tell you that the thing that stuck out to me as I learned more about this was the idea that a single agent can act on behalf of multiple candidates. And I think that most Canadians would find that curious. We understand that elections are competitive processes between teams of people. So the idea that you would have one coach, or one manager for multiple teams, I think rightfully strikes people as against the competitive spirit of the election and suggests that this is something other than candidates who want to contest the election. And I think that's clear, even from what the committee has said, that they're not actually about putting up competitive candidates. They're about making a larger point that they want a different electoral system from the one that we have.
Switching the gears a little bit around political financing, I just want to hear your thoughts on the risk of foreign influence through political financing, and what you think are the many vulnerabilities that exist in our political financing regime right now.
It's a good question. It's one on which I'm not an expert. So you will hear from other people who are experts on it. I think that the biggest vulnerability is a little bit of what I articulated to Mr. Lewis, but put slightly differently, that just as the costs of communicating go down, the ability of people to use small amounts of money to influence our elections is greater than it was before, right? And the idea that it would be impossible for a person from Russia to put an ad on the CBC or CTV, right? But it's not impossible for them to put one on Twitter. So the permeability of platforms versus broadcast networks and radio networks is, I think, probably the most serious vulnerability. That's less about where the money's coming from, and it's about the ability of money to be put to speech on these platforms.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madame Kayabaga. We will proceed to Madame Normandin, but just keeping in mind that we are approaching noon, but we do have a little bit of extra time, so I will add another minute to the remaining three questioners. So 3.5 minutes, Madame Normandin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Some questions for you, Mr. Shukovich, if I may. The idea behind the longest ballot committee is to be militant with a view to having electoral overhaul or reform. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What's your perception about the ability of your message to actually percolate up in the public and cut through? Have your efforts really hit their mark to date?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I think me being invited here is pretty good evidence that we've been very successful. We get lots of media attention, and just at a basic level, whenever I talk to someone and say, hey, did you know politicians write the rules of their own election? They say, oh, that's stupid. So it clicks with people right away. It's very obviously a conflict of interest.
Je vais reformuler ma question.
I'll reformulate my question, take another stab at it. Folks are aware of the existence of the longest ballot committee, but in your opinion, do they really understand the message that you are championing when it comes to electoral reform?
Yeah, I think people do understand the message. It's very straightforward that politicians are obviously in a conflict of interest when they are in charge of writing the rules for their own elections. It's a very simple message, and people understand it and generally agree with me, unless they have partisan interests.
Je comprends qu'une des façons
Now, I understand that one way of determining the success of your company or your organisation is by your presence here today. What are the other indicators as far as your message cutting through and percolating up in the public?
Like I said, we get a lot of media attention. It's really great. We get a lot of candidates putting themselves out there and doing media interviews. We've got international attention for the first person to get 0 votes in history, so that was very cool. We get lots of positive messages. People are always happy to see what we're doing, and they want to join next time. So I think it's been very positive, and people really resonate with the message that politicians shouldn't be in charge of the rules of their own elections.
Au risque de me répéter, vous l'avez mentionné.
At risk of repeating myself, you mentioned that one way of determining or calculating the success of your organisation is by way of your presence here today. Do you really get the sense that your presence here today is tangibly contributing to your demand for an overhaul of the electoral system? Or on the contrary, are you in fact discrediting this issue, which is in other respects legitimate and quite praiseworthy?
So like I was saying, people with partisan interests obviously don't want to hear that election laws should be decided by non-partisan bodies. It's great. You people are in charge of the Elections Act, and I get to be right in here in front of you and telling you, maybe you shouldn't be. This is very positive.
Merci beaucoup. I'd like to thank Madame Normandin. She is always on time and keeping track of the time, something for all of us to strive towards. So, merci beaucoup. Mr. Calkins, for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I always appreciate hearing from Canadians, particularly those who think we shouldn't have politicians making laws. They think that other people should be making laws other than people who are actually elected and accountable and re-accountable to the electorate. I fail to see the logic, to be quite frank with you, given the fact, as my colleague Mr. Jackson said, even when the Liberals had a majority in 2015 to 2019 and proposed electoral reform, the Canadian public actually, through their elected representatives, decide whether or not something is going to be palatable. And that's how we actually go through the sausage-making effort of making laws, regulations, including laws regarding our elections being at this particular committee. Anybody with a basic understanding of a civics class would know that. But I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Lowen. Mr. Lowen, in 2017, an Alberta court decision ruled that a provision in our electoral laws requiring a $1,000 deposit was a violation of the Charter on Rights and Freedoms. Do you, first of all, I think you would agree that elections are serious business. I don't think there's a more serious thing that a Canadian can do than cast their ballot in the democratic process. We're approaching Veterans Week and Remembrance Day. Over 120,000 Canadians have paid with their lives in order to make sure that we can all do this. This is serious business. It's about as serious business as it gets. I always interpreted that $1,000 requirement to be something put in place to make sure that unserious people weren't able to just get their name on the ballot. Do you think the government made a mistake by not challenging or trying to challenge that decision made by an Alberta court in 2017?
I have to confess I'm not deeply fluent with the case, so I don't know the jurisprudential argument for it. It strikes me as an entirely reasonable limit of $1,000. What I will say is that Canadian elections are cheap. I know it seems like perhaps I don't know actually whether MPs feel like they're spending a lot of money or not, but I do know that many of you raise more money than you can spend, and we also have examples of candidates who can win without spending a lot of money. I think it's great that for the most part we've put pretty serious caps on our election spending, so that who wins is not determined purely by who raises more money. Now, where those exact limits are, Mr. Calkins, I'm not sure, but I do think that that $1,000, clearly that $1,000 deposit plus changes in the signatures, or the ease of signatures, and the fact that one could be an agent for multiple candidates, does make the ballot probably more permeable than is desirable, as evidenced by the ballots in the last election.
Thank you for that. You've answered the second part of my question as to whether or not you think that should be put back in place. I don't know if there's a possibility to do that now, given the fact that I think the time for challenging that court decision has elapsed. Do you think that in order to protect the integrity of our electoral system and treat it with the seriousness that it deserves, that this committee should look at the definition of registered third parties and to make sure that this is obviously a very organized effort? Is there anything that you would advise us to do with the definition of a third party?
Yes, I mean, I think this is critically important, and I'll note that your party has a history of being the least supportive of regulations on third parties. And I'm not saying it to score a point or anything, but I think I raise it, Mr. Calkins, to note that I think we've come to a consensus in the country, even among your party, that it's good to have elections contested principally among political parties without huge outside influence, and I think that's a good thing. And I actually changed my own opinion on it over time. So as the cost of advertising changes and as the tactics of third parties change, I think it is worth asking whether legislation is fit for purpose to achieve what the overall animating principle is in Canadian elections, which is that elections should be a conversation between parties and voters without the cacophonous entry of hundreds of other people into that conversation.
Thank you very much. Now to Mr. Shushevich. The Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Perot, told the committee that people should face penalties for signing multiple nomination papers. Would you agree with that statement?
I believe that was one of his suggestions. I don't really see a reason for that. I don't really see the logic in it. Personally, I prefer it when there's more than one candidate on the ballot. So I should be able, as a voter, to nominate more than one candidate.
You're aware that Section 480.1, subsection 1, says every person is guilty of an offense who with intent mislead falsely represents themselves to be or causes anyone to falsely represent them to be a candidate or a person who is authorized to act on a candidate's behalf. Would you agree that asking somebody to sign a nomination paper that has all candidates written at the top or no candidate's name would be a false representation under the Act?
No, I'm not a legal expert, but I don't believe it was. Of course, the returning officer determined that wasn't acceptable to be, like the candidates couldn't get accepted based on those forms, and so they were refused, and that's fine.
Also in the Elections Act, Section 482(1), every person is guilty of an offence who obstructs or hinders or knowingly makes, either orally or in writing, a false or misleading statement to the Commissioner of Elections of Canada Elections or any person acting under his or her direction, while the Commissioner or the person acting under his or her direction is exercising or performing powers, duties, or functions conferred or imposed upon the Commissioner under this Act. So that's obstruction. Do you think any of the actions of your committee have actually obstructed and met the definition here for obstruction under Elections Canada? And have you been given any warnings? Have you been given any reprimands? And have you been threatened with charges by Elections Canada?
Certainly not to any of those questions. I've never been reprimanded and have no intention of misleading anyone. We have nothing to hide. We do everything by the book.
My colleague,
Thank you very much, Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Chair.
Go now to Madame Brière. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our two witnesses for being with us here today. Professor Lowen, we know that it is difficult to get people to take the leap and go into politics, particularly women. Do you think that the longest ballot committee's tactics in any way make it even tougher for people to take that leap and enter politics?
I'm not sure. Because I think the effects are probably small, I suspect that they aren't. That it's not having a huge effect there, though it could be having one. But I think that the notion that elections are kind of something that you play with strikes me as degrading at all. So perhaps that makes it less appealing to both male and female candidates. But I'm not sure that it would have a differential effect on women.
Okay. Thank you. Merci. Est-ce que aussi vous croyez...
Now, do you believe that it is too easy to get your name on the ballot in any riding whatsoever, in the sense that you only need 100 signatures and get an official agent? We know that the longest ballot committee's actions have led to a lot of chaos in recent elections, including by-elections. So do you think that we need to take a stand against these kinds of actions, or should we just allow the status quo to play out, or should we be thinking about a more in-depth overhaul of our electoral process?
I think that it seems clear to me that the combination of 100 signatures plus allowing a small group of people, one person, two people, to harvest the signatures necessary to get candidates on is leading to ballots that are too long. Now, I guess the choice you have is whether you legislate against that directly, right, or whether you just hope that this goes away. And that's kind of a serious choice about what you want to spend your legislative time on. I will just tell you that in my professional opinion, I think it's hard to sustain an argument that this behavior is desirable for democracy. I don't think it's good that people are using the ballot principally for something other than putting up candidates in front of people. It's not a petition, and it's not a social media stunt. It's the presentation of people who want to represent other people in office and are willing to go out there and put their ideas to the test. So it just kind of it offends me a little bit. Now, whether or not you should spend time legislating against it or not, that's another question. But I could certainly see why you would.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Zukovic, if I may. Can you hear me? You can, good. So your actions have been described as in many different ways, in fact, and you said that you're happy to be here today and to have gotten politicians' attention. Do you really think that what you are doing is achieving your true objectives, or do you think instead that we should sit down around a table and have an in-depth, good faith discussion about what your goals are, i.e. electoral reform at the end of the day?
Yes, thank you for the question. This committee has mandate over election law and conflict of interest. So yes, this is the perfect place for you all to be discussing whether or not it's appropriate for MPs to be writing the rules of their own elections.
I'm okay. No, it's okay.
Thank you so much, Madame Briere. I will exercise my ability as chair to ask a question, and it's picking up on what Mr. Culkins was alluding to with appointing people who would seemingly not be accountable. I know in our system, and I think you even spoke about it in terms of the Elections Canada being respected. The executive appoints a nominee to be the head of Elections Canada, and an organization that's independent like the RCMP is appointed and then is accountable to Parliament. It worries me that you're proposing an agency that may not be accountable. Who are these individuals who would be appointed to this committee? I guess is my question, if it wasn't going to be politicians or the executive who was going to make that appointment.
Yep, that's a fantastic question. I'm not a policy expert. It's very obvious to everyone that it's inappropriate for conflict of interest for MPs to be in charge of it. So I'm extremely confident that if you had an in-depth discussion about it, you could come up with something very reasonable.
So well, I guess I'll leave it as a comment that it's very bizarre to me that you're engaging in this protest without the very basic answer to the first question that would come up in solving what you are seeking to protest. But I appreciate you appearing before the committee. We will suspend for a few minutes to set up for the next panel. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses for today's second panel as individuals. Louis-Philippe Sauvé, the former Member of Parliament for La Salle et Marne Verdun, and Dr. Laurie Turnbull, Professor, Faculty of Management at, this is going to pain me as someone from St. Catharines, because we say Dalhousie, but Dalhousie University. It's very painful. I want that noted on the record. Monsieur Sauvé, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Members of Parliament, members of the committee, thank you for this invitation to testify before you today about the events of the 16th of September 2024 and the role that the longest ballot committee played, but also the conduct of the electoral process itself. I'm not here today to promote or champion any particular opinion, but just to testify before you about the events and to respond to your questions. So when I was invited to appear before the committee, I in fact undertook to gather testimony from members of my campaign organisation and election staff, people who played a strategic role in my campaign, Stephen Serroux, the campaign director, and also a gentleman from the Bloc Québécois, and Pierre Norris, who was my representative in a polling station, and Ms. Suzanne Grosset and Thérèse Robichaud. I'd like to thank them. They were returning officers, and they responded to my questions, as well as Ms. Céline Bibot, who also played a role. So I'm here primarily to answer your questions. You can ask me questions not only about how things played out, but about my personal convictions as a citizen who held the role of parliamentarian that you have the privilege of holding today. So there you have it.
Dr. Turnbull, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'll try not to be the witness who goes over the 5 minutes. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I've thought about the actions of the longest ballot committee a lot, and so I really appreciate being included in the conversation. There are many things about the state of our democracy that keep me awake at night. I think that voter apathy is a big problem. I think mis and disinformation are big problems. Polarization is a big problem. Foreign interference is a problem, and it's not going anywhere. We don't have to look too far to see one of the world's greatest democracies be in serious trouble, and I don't think Canada is immune to effects of democratic regression that we can see around the world. In light of all of this, with all due respect to the longest ballot committee, what they're doing doesn't keep me awake at night. I think that I completely agree with Professor Lowen when he says that this is undesirable. To have ballots flooded intentionally with names of people who have no real intention of representing the riding risks making a mockery of this ballot. It's not desirable. I think it's a waste of time and a waste of resources. But I also think that we've shown that we can manage it. As individuals associated with the committee have pointed out, Elections Canada is a very strong, independent, competent organization that runs free and fair elections. They can handle a stunt or two, and they've been the ones that have had to count these ballots, and so they're, in my view, the real victims of the longest ballot committee's tomfoolery. But I think that when they came up with this response of the write-in ballot rather than letting this longest ballot continue in the Battle River Crowfoot by-election, honestly, I thought that was brilliant, and I thought it was a really good response that kind of took the air out of the longest ballot committee's tires. So I'm not sure that we won't see the end of this kind of thing from now on. I have to say, though, that while I find myself kind of frustrated but not overly concerned with the tactics employed by the longest ballot committee, the argument around potential conflict of interest has been made before. That's something that's come up before in terms of studying how we might get to electoral reform, even if we never were to change the electoral system. Is it the right way to have politicians who, as partisans, are, yes, they have an interest. You have an interest in what kind of system we use, what kind of rules we use to elect people. And so is there a conflict there? That said, I'm not sure that there really is a better way to do it. The citizens, if you really want to see electoral reform happen, we've had Citizens' Assembly several times, and even when the Citizens' Assembly is in favor of it, it doesn't necessarily convince enough of the public to move it over, although the 57% in British Columbia, we can talk about that. One thing I did want to raise, though, in what I've heard from the longest ballot committee, the focus is on elected officials. And I would, since we're here and having the conversation, invite us to do a little bit of thinking on the role of political parties. Because when politicians are coming to these questions about what electoral system we should have, if there's a conflict of interest here in this role, it's not just because the people are elected, it's also because they're members of political parties, and political parties often have some stance on these issues, and political parties are acting as sort of disciplined organizations. Elected officials are part of those political parties. And so I think it's worth thinking about the kinds of things that political parties do, both as public institutions and kind of as private clubs. And I think in the last year or so, when we've talked about things like irregularities in nomination and leadership processes, things like that, we've talked about the role of political parties as kind of gatekeepers of democracy, and they have a pretty firm grip on it. And when we're talking about things like nominations, leadership, political parties are making decisions about who gets to play. It's not just about the rules, it's about who's included in the whole process. And so while we're here, I think it would be interesting to reflect on the role of political parties and what they're doing in terms of facilitating democracy, and I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. We're 4 for 4. All the witnesses under time, and the chair appreciates it. Mr. Van Popta is first for the Conservative Party. 6 minutes, please.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here, Mr. Sauvé and Dr. Turnbull. I have a question for you, Dr. Turnbull. You said in a recent publication about the leader of the opposition and the recent by-election in Battle River Crowfoot. I think that's what you're talking about. You go, Mr. Poilievre has called these actions of the longest ballot committee a scam and a blatant abuse of electoral democracy, and he's right. You agreed with him. The longest ballot committee's ballot hijacking has no democratic value, serves no public purpose, and stands no chance of setting up a serious conversation about electoral reform. Yet you say in that article, and as you were saying today, even though you might be disturbed by their actions, you don't think that it should compel us to change the rules. Now, I might even be convinced by that if the actions of the longest ballot committee were leading to an intelligent conversation about electoral reform, but it is not. We heard Mr. Sienkiewicz here earlier today acknowledging that what they were doing was a political prank, and he was even proud that at least one candidate got 0 votes at all. These people are not serious, and it is not leading to a serious conversation. So why wouldn't we counter this belligerence and this obstinacy and this political prank making?
So I totally agree with everything you just said. The only concern I have is the extent to which any legislative response could make life more difficult for independent candidates who are serious. Because I think, like, say, for example, we said we're going to require more signatures as a way of really testing, whether or not the candidacy is serious. I think for a political party who's someone who's running with a political party who's got that network of support, it's going to be easy for that person to meet the threshold if it was higher. But for a truly independent candidate who is serious, who wants to run to be the representative of the riding, and that's important, I don't want that person to have to pay an extra price because of the longest ballot committee. That's my only concern.
Good. Well, thank you for that. One of the proposed legislative changes is exactly about that, about requiring 100 unique signatures. So, in other words, one person couldn't sign 200 nomination forms. And, getting 100 signatures is not that difficult, really, for a serious candidate, somebody who's well connected to their community. Everybody's got 10 friends who has 10 more friends, and get your 100 signatures. But we heard Mr. Sienkiewicz saying that they gamed the system. He was accused of having a blank form and getting it signed. He says it wasn't blank at all. It had the words "all candidates" at the top. So it might as well have been blank. And so people are gaming the system, and I think that it's time for us to reform the system by making that one small rule change. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I listened with interest to the exchange between your former witness and Mr. Cooper. That was fascinating. There would be no value to having someone sign a form with no candidate's name on it. There would be equally no value of having someone sign the form with all candidates' names on it. I wasn't there, but I can't imagine that Elections Canada would find that acceptable. What are you supporting then? So as far as like this case in particular really brought to my attention this idea that people are signing multiple forms. If somebody was doing that in good faith, right? Like say if I know two people who are running for office in the same riding and I sign both their forms, if I'm doing that not as part of some grand scam, but because I believe in the viability of the candidacy of these two people, I don't think in that case that democracy is suffering for that. I'm just sort of saying, yes, these are two serious people. But if there's a coordinated effort to make sure that the same 100 signatures are standing up whoever, right, and they don't even know who they are, yeah, you know, as much as I can see the point around trying to make a rule about that.
Sure, but where do we find the balance? That was a question that Ms. Normandin asked witnesses in the previous panel. Where do we find the balance between somebody legitimately wanting to sign two candidates' forms and somebody gaming the system by signing hundreds or even dozens?
Yes. Realistically, there might not be a perfect balance there, because when you think about it, if you're going to create a rule that creates a restraint on someone else's right? For example, if you made a rule like this, you can only sign one form, then yeah, I mean, technically you're making a restriction on voters. Are there that many voters who are signing more than one form? Probably not. I don't think that's a major problem, so to the extent that that's restricting the kind of range of motion of the voter, it's probably not too heavy a restriction for most people. In fact, most people.
So a reasonable restriction on people's
I think you could make that
rights
argument.
to participate in the electoral system.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for that. Do I still have a minute?
You have about 40 seconds.
Okay, just quickly. I didn't have a chance to ask Mr. Shukevich any questions, but I'm really puzzled about his statements that we're in a conflict of interest to change to make the rules. In British Columbia, in my riding, we've had referendum 3 times. On changing the electoral system. It was not politicians who were making the rules. There was a citizens' assembly, just like the previous witnesses said that we should have, and yet every time it was rejected. People generally appreciate the first past the post system that we have, and ultimately it was the people who made that decision. Maybe you could comment on that.
Very brief answer, Dr. Turnbull, if we can.
I think one of the reasons is that people value local representation. I've seen some evidence to suggest that when you think about larger multi-member ridings, there's some concern about that, but I'm being really brief because I know there's no time.
Thank you so much. Move on to Madame Kayabaga. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I also would like to extend my gratitude to our witnesses today. Dr. Turnbull, in your opening comments, you did mention, actually, the spirit behind the long ballots is that the citizens who participated in this felt that politicians have a conflict of interest. And in your comments, you did sort of agree. What would you suggest as an alternative to how changes on, electoral forms are done?
So I can understand the argument that there's a conflict for the politician who's making rules or voting on rules that then help them or don't get elected, right? And I think we can look throughout history at some examples of how, say, certain political parties tend to be disadvantaged by the system we have. And so I think there's evidence to suggest that the NDP throughout history have sometimes not, sometimes they've done really well. 2011 went really well. But for some other times, that because the party's votes are distributed more thinly across the country as opposed to concentrated in a single province like the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, for example, the Bloc Québécois being regionally concentrated tends to do a little better by first past the post than the NDP would. However, if we start talking about then what do you use as opposed to the House of Commons, who else should make this decision? It's much easier to think about that in theory than it is to think about that in practice. In theory, we assemble 50 really smart people and get them, really jazzed up about electoral systems, and we put them in some kind of cone of silence where they have no conflict of interest of their own, and this is not going to be penetrated by political parties. None of this is really possible. And they spit out the right electoral system. But then what, right? There's no accountability for those people.
And is that with the assumption that most Canadians are partisan and have a political leaning?
I don't think most Canadians are. I mean, not many people are members of political parties, and I think we see a lot of promiscuity, frankly, in terms of what people do with their ballot. People jump all over the place all the time in terms of who they vote for. So I wouldn't say we're certainly not like, the U.S. people put it on their sleeve, the Republican or Democrat. We've never had that kind of reality or culture here.
So I'm just trying to understand. So if we're in 2025 and most democratic reforms have been done through this place, and Canadians have voted for folks who have made these changes, why the change now? Like why is there a conflict now that wasn't there before?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think if you really pushed on the concept of conflict of interest, it becomes problematic, because one could make the argument that politicians are almost always in a conflict of interest. Anything you decide it could affect you somehow, right? And so if you push it too hard, I think as a concept it's interesting to think about people who are players in the game or making the rules of the game. Like that's fair enough, and we can think about that. And there are going to be political reasons why some parties will say we're never going to change the electoral system because we like the one we have. It works for us, right? That's real. That's real. But politicians you're also accountable for the decisions you make. So you've got to face the public, whereas members of a citizens' assembly wouldn't in the same way.
I do want to get your thoughts on disinformation and public platforms such as social media platforms. What do you think is the role of governments in regulating AI, for example, AI systems around disinformation without falling into the territory of censorship and partisanship as well?
Oh, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult to think about how to put it in motion, how to operationalize a government role. I think that the most important thing is that citizens need to be able to practice civic self-defense on their own. I think there needs to be a lot of, what government can do, civic literacy, actually really give a role for people to become. I know education is provincial jurisdiction, but it's really, really important that people are able to tell.
Do you think that right now, with the level of education that that is available to the Canadian public, is enough for people to understand what is disinformation and what isn't on social media platforms?
I'm not sure about that. I think people are becoming more discerning, and unfortunately, I think we're getting to a point where sometimes we don't know if we can believe anything.
Yeah.
And we have to double and triple check everything, which maybe is that's the world we're in. I think it's really helpful for organizations that are nonpartisan, like Elections Canada, to help citizens develop that sense of you need to double and triple check to make sure, especially at election time. But it's hard to do. And we also have, for example, when we're talking about foreign interference, a lot of times you're not talking about messages that are going across the board to all Canadians and we can see them all in broad daylight. We're talking about targeted messaging at a small part of the population, which doesn't go through the filter of, CBC, CTV, like Professor Lowen was talking about. Those sorts of things can be harder to detect. But I do think that the role of SITE during the campaign, for example, was performed very well. So we're not lost. We're doing some things right.
Just a few seconds left.
Yeah, so. Maybe if she could just say anything on that and political financing as well and how that ties.
That was your few seconds. So it was literally a few seconds, but I appreciate that. And Dr. Turnbull, I will be using promiscuity of voters. I did enjoy that, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
6 minutes, and thanks to both of our witnesses. I'll start with you, Mr. Sauvé, if I may. You did a lot of door-to-door knocking during the campaign, and I'm sure that a lot of folks referred to the longest ballot committee. I'd like to hear your takeaways, the input that you heard, those that talked about it a lot, and did they draw a link between the committee and its demands for electoral reform? Thank you for your question. Well, all of the people that I met with told me how they were disgruntled by how ridiculous and wacky it all was. No one, when I knocked on doors, said, oh, this is fantastic what this longest ballot committee is doing. So that's the first thing. Now, we try and see this a little bit facetiously when it comes to voters. But voters found that it was ridiculous, and they didn't draw any link between the demands of the committee and the approach that they were taking. Question. In your opening remarks, you said that before testifying before this committee, you spoke with deputy returning officers and your campaign organiser and folks out on the field. Now, how has this actual long ballot had an impact on the BVO day and at various points in the election over the well, there were a couple of problems. The list of candidates wasn't available at some points, the full list, and that could have caused problems for voters who were looking for the name of a serious candidate. Now, in terms of the early polling station, yes, there were issues. The location that was set up for polling wasn't big enough. Now, I think that issue applies to elections writ large, because the more voters vote early, well, the Chief Electoral Officer has to account for those needs in society. Now, when it comes to ballot counting itself, obviously, the size of the polling station is such that oftentimes the ballot boxes were full early in the day, and the ballot boxes had to be emptied at several points during the ballot counting, and that had an upshot when it in the terms of how long it took to count the ballots. Ms. Bibot, she said to me that she left the polling station at 3 a.m. because the ballot boxes didn't balance out when they were counting them, and the figures just didn't add up. So she had to go to the CEO's office and drop off all the ballot boxes. She went home at 3 a.m. and she couldn't even go in the next morning to work because of those hours. And I think it's crucial that parliamentarians and the folks from the longest ballot committee factor in that polling staff are often students, they're often seniors that want to make a bit of money on the side because they are not really wealthy folks, and we have to think about them. They're people who are grassroots people, salt of the earth, who care about democracy, and, we shouldn't be placing that burden on them. Now, Mr. Norris was my rep in a polling station, and he said to me that the electoral staff was really stressed and overwhelmed and far less accommodating with politicians because of the stress that they're undergoing. Thank you. Question. Ms. Turnbull, a question for you as well as Mr. Sauvé, about the notion of restricting signatures to a unique signature, i.e. one elector, one signature. Now, at the start of the electoral process, you don't necessarily know who you're going to vote for. Wouldn't you be limiting people's choices if, they perhaps want to vote potentially for two candidates? Wouldn't you be straitjacketing them in a sense because of these unique signatures? Isn't that part and parcel of democracy, that an individual would want to see multiple names on a candidate, on a ballot? Wouldn't that shoot us in the foot when it comes to democratic reform? Response. Well, I think that it's a laudable idea, but ill-informed. In terms of this harvesting of signatures, as a candidate, I signed the nomination papers for my opponent from the Rhinoceros Party. So I thought that person's I won't go there. But the fact remains that it's about the principle of democracy here. We have to give folks an opportunity to run. And when I asked for people to sign my ballot, I wasn't saying vote for me. I was just saying give me an opportunity to run. And it's in that spirit that we need to proceed. And these folks from the longest ballot committee, I watched them signing the ballots and I refused to sign. Now, citizens in a Republican spirit have to be accountable when it comes to signatures and the political action that they are taking by voting and signing. Ms. Turnbull, I'd like to hear your response, but I'll hear it in the next round, Ms. Turnbull, because I've run out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Picking up where Madame Normandin left off, the Chief Electoral Officer in his testimony stated that the purpose of the Act, with respect to the signing of nomination papers, is that candidates need 100 signatures to endorse their candidacy, not for 100 electors to flood the ballot with an endless list of candidates. And I'm paraphrasing what the Chief Electoral Officer said. I think you would agree with that, Madam Turnbull, Professor Turnbull. And so you earlier, I think in answer to Mr. Van Popta, said that in circumstances like we saw with the longest ballot committee, where a small group of electors were signing multiple forms with clearly the intent of creating what took place with the longest ballot committee and disrupting the electoral process, that perhaps there would be room to make amendments to the Canada Elections Act to address that. So if not limiting it to or mandating exclusive signatures or prohibiting electors from signing multiple papers, then what would be the alternative solution?
Right. I don't know. To me, it's unfortunate if we have to make a restriction, because I understand the point too. Certainly it's possible for you to want to acknowledge as an elector the validity of multiple candidates. And that in itself doesn't cause any problem to me at all if all of those candidates are real. But if it's part of an effort that is designed to go along with a stunt sort of thing, it serves no democratic purpose. I can understand the point in wanting to make sure that voters don't end up participating in that.
Another suggestion was limiting official agents to acting for one candidate. What are your thoughts on that type of an amendment?
That makes sense. That makes total sense.
Okay. Yeah. Now, Mr. Sauvé, thank you. Good to see you back here. You spoke about the disruption that occurred in terms of administering the election in LaSalle-Verdun. What about in terms of the impact that it had on voters in terms of filling out the ballot? Persons who might have certain barriers, whether it be mobility issues, literacy issues, visual impairment issues. Can you speak to that?
Bien, en fait, ça me rappelle que...
Well, in fact, your question reminds me that on early polling day, I drove one of our voters who had a visual impairment, and I drove her to the polling station. Now, we have that kind of check and balance in the electoral system, i.e. a returning officer who swears under oath that such and such is occurring. That's provided for. So I don't think it had a major impact on the outcome of the poll itself. Now, that said, when it comes to electors, well, obviously it is frustrating, but I don't think it had an effect on the outcome of the election, as my result attests to, and also the result from the Crawford Battleford River. Now, to a certain extent,
I don't think anyone is asserting that that this committee caused or impacted the overall outcome of an election, but it did create challenges for individual voters, correct?
Oui, absolument. C'est sûr que ça crée des
yes,
enjeux.
It did create challenges for individual voters, but not insurmountable challenges, to the extent that if the returning officer, in fact, factors those potential effects now, it's just a matter of organisation at the end of the day, making sure that things run smoothly. But in response to your question, and what I was about to get to, was that to a certain extent, it enables voters to better hone in on their choice, to know truly who they're going to vote for with certainty, because in the case of that election, my opponent from the NDP had the same family name as me. So obviously, when we were communicating with voters, we tried to stress the point that we shared the same family name. So, and we adapted in our communication strategy. I'm not saying that it's ideal, nevertheless, but in terms of the outcome, I don't think it was significant or meaningful.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wilkinson, 5 minutes, please. Welcome, and welcome to our newest member, Mr. Wilkinson.
Well, thank you very much. So let me, I guess, ask a question of Professor Turnbull. I come to this conversation as somebody who actually is sympathetic to the discussion around electoral reform. I think it's a desirable conversation to have. But there are avenues that are available presently. Certainly, those who feel strongly about it can convince political parties to make it a part of their platform, as the Liberals did in 2015. And when folks come to see me about this, I say to them the best way to do that is to show that the public cares. If you poll on this issue, and there's 20 issues, it's typically 18th, 19th, or 20th on the minds of Canadians. The other is you can just run candidates that are single-issue candidates that actually focus on this particular issue. On the other hand, the longest ballot committee clearly creates the potential for the frustration of voters. If you think about the lineups that actually potentially can exist in many constituencies, people will just not vote. They'll bail out of the line and they actually won't vote. So this is a tactic that actually is frustrating the democratic rights of Canadians. I hear your argument about, we don't want to put restraints or restrictions on the range of voter freedom. But I mean, in my mind, we actually already do that. We don't allow people to sign the nominations of people who live in the riding beside you. You have to live in your own riding. And so there are ways in which we have done that. And so I guess my question is, in your opinion, given that this tactic can frustrate the rights of those people who actually are serious about voting, what should we do about this if we're not prepared to put those kinds of minimal restrictions on the range of freedom? It just seems to me that the ability to sign only one nomination form is not a particularly big restriction.
Yes, I agree. I don't think it's a big restriction either. I think it's a restriction, but it's probably one that we can justify because, again, I don't think it's going to affect all that many people when it comes down to it. And I think also I want to say again that I thought that the response that Elections Canada came up with was fantastic. Write the name down. And as far as I know, in Battle River Crowfoot, there was not, there didn't seem to be any problem with that. There was no big concern around, more spoiled ballots or something like that. It seems like that kind of went okay. And so if it's possible for Elections Canada to pivot in those sorts of circumstances, and if this tactic is tried again, they can say, well, we're just not going to print a big long ballot. People are going to write in the name. And that's it. I thought that was great.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you a sort of a higher level question around the impact of the rise of artificial intelligence and deepfakes. How much do you think we should be concerned about it being easier for foreign actors to try to influence our elections? And what should we be thinking about doing in that area?
So I do think this is a significant cause for concern. And I do think that a lot of times when it comes to specifically foreign efforts to affect the conversation in an election, that these things are happening at the community level to a large extent. And so it's going to require a lot of work, I think, with local communities, with diaspora communities, to understand what's going on and what kinds of communications that they're receiving. And we are doing some of that work. Like I kept track of everything SITE did during as much as I could during the election campaign. And there were public announcements around some of what was happening. And that helps voters to determine how to make the right decisions and what information is coming at them. And in several cases that I'm thinking of right now, there was an AI component. There was an effort made to make this piece of information look authentic and look sophisticated. And so that's the world we're in. I think it's important for it's an education thing more than anything else. Trying to go down the road of controlling communication is very difficult. When it comes to something like generative AI in like political ads, I agree with those who say we shouldn't be doing that, because it's an election. It's not just about like trying to get the most sophisticated kinds of ways of getting people's attention. Like we're giving voters information about who they should be voting for. We have to take that really seriously.
Thank you very much.
I mean, following on that,
Mr. Wilkinson, you have 5 seconds left. So,
right, I will pass.
I appreciate that, Mr. Wilkinson. We'll go on to Madame Normandin, s'il vous plaît. 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais poser une...
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask another question of both witnesses. Mr. Sylvie, you talked about the heightened pressure on election workers because of the longer ballots. Now, if election after election we are seeing this kind of stunt to disrupt the electoral process, don't we run a risk of these election workers just dropping out? We know that not all election workers turn up on election day. That causes problems. There were some polling stations that we referred to last week that didn't even open up because there was a dearth of polling workers. So shouldn't we keep that in mind, that risk of discouraging election workers from volunteering or working if this ballot continues to be lengthy? Response. Well, let me be clear. In my opinion, parliamentarians need to act to make this kind of thing tougher. But the question is how? And the onus is on you to decide the how. Quite clearly and evidently, if we make decisions based on emotion, it might be good in terms of politicking, but it's not necessarily good policy. So it's about finding the right way of going about this. I think by increasing the number of signatures, by increasing the restrictions or requirements in terms of the officer, that's a good idea, but I don't think we should prevent citizens from signing off on more than one ballot necessarily. And of course, we do need to think about our election workers. Ms. Turnbull, on election workers, should we be considering them in this equation, i.e. the risk of discouraging them from working if they know that they're going to have to grapple with these lengthy ballots going forward?
I think so. I mean, I can certainly, I really do think that the ones who are counting those ballots are the ones who are really absorbing the effect of what the longest ballot committee is doing, because it seems to me whenever this tactic has been tried in by-elections and in general elections, the number of people who are voting for the people who are associated with this organization, it's minimal. It's not changing the result, and it's not coming close to changing the result anywhere. We don't have to worry about it from that perspective, but it's the administration when it comes to just operationalizing on election day. And I mean, I take the points around people expect, ballots to be counted fairly quickly. We want to know what the results are. Like that's fair enough. But just going through these stuffed ballot, like there's no point in this. It would be different if it served a democratic purpose, but it doesn't. It's just a waste of time and a waste of resources.
Thank you so much. I believe Mr. Culkins is up first, but we'll be splitting with Mr. Jackson, but I'll leave that timing up to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses that are here. Obviously, the committee is now seized with the questions surrounding the longest ballot committee, and I appreciate both of you being here. But I'm just going to read a statement to you, Professor Turnbull, and I want you to tell me if you think that the intentions or the motivations of the longest ballot committee would meet this definition. A mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation that disrespects or undermines the spirit, rules, or integrity of the contest.
I'm so sorry. Can you say it again? Yep.
A mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation that disrespects or undermines the spirit, rules, or integrity of the contest.
I definitely agree with the mockery part. I think the fact that there's, yes, I think so. Yeah, because the initial phrasing is or, isn't it? It doesn't have to meet all three of those things.
That's right.
So, yes.
Do you know where I got that statement from? It's okay to say no. So this is actually grounds for a 10-minute misconduct in a game of hockey.
Oh, neat.
It's called travesty of the game.
I like that.
Okay. And to my knowledge, there's nothing in our Elections Act that actually has any clause in it like this. If you make a travesty as a player, as a coach, whatever the case might be, even as a fan, there's a consequence of behaving that way. And I'm wondering, given the fact that we've lost the ability to at least put a barrier in front of unserious people by having a non-refundable deposit. We lost that in 2017 with that Alberta court decision that wasn't appealed. And given the testimony that you've given us in regards to whether or not you think changing the process for getting people to sign nomination papers might not have the desired outcome, I'm left wondering what we could possibly do. But I can tell you, I am in the riding right next door to Battle River Crowfoot in Alberta, and I heard more from my constituents during the by-election about how ridiculous and ashamed and embarrassed the voters in my constituency were of what was transpiring in the by-election right next door as a result of having over 200 names on the ballot. And the words they used were things like travesty, or they even surmised even greater nefarious motives behind that movement than what the individual who just testified here actually said. Do you think it's possible to craft a piece of a part of the legislation that would actually be enforceable? And who would be the adjudicator of whether or not somebody is making a mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation of our elections?
Right. So yes, I think. So first of all, I really like this line of argument in terms of trying to put something in the legislation that protects the integrity of elections, because I think we're in a number of ways the integrity of elections is tested, and we have to find ways for the public to be protected, which is really what it's about. It's about protecting the public's ability to choose their representatives in a way that is not taken over by these sorts of campaigns that actually have nothing to do with the vote on the ballot in that particular riding. So I think it's a way. There's a way for language to be crafted so that it's not going too far. I think that's the key. If you make it too heavy, if you make it the range too far, then it will be too much. Like overlap, like kind of too much of a restriction on rights and things like that, and then that'll be struck down. As far as who makes the decision, I mean, I can see that landing in court if people are, I think that's probably where it would end up.
Just so you know, you went 4 minutes, 20 seconds.
I'll be very quick, Chair. Just to summarize, because I agree that we've probably given this too much time, this farce, to be honest, and the individual is pleased that they got 0% or 0 votes in a constituency which got international headlines. But we do need to have an outcome out of this. So to summarize your position, you do not support the restriction of signatures to only being able to sign one candidate's paper, but you would support a change that one official agent can only be the official agent for one candidate anywhere in the country. Is that a clear statement of your position?
Absolutely yes on the official agent piece. And on the second part, I wish we didn't have to do it. I wish we didn't have to restrict signatures, because I just think that for the reasons I've said, but I'll live with it. I wouldn't say you got it wrong if you decided that you're going to go that way. I understand.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. You're a bit over time, but that was an excellent use of 40 seconds. Textbook. That was excellent. Mr. Lewis, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll also be sharing my time with Madame Briere. Thank you both for your testimony. Just to pick up, Dr. Turnbull, you're talking about protecting the integrity of our elections. You talked about what keeps you up at night. The single biggest risk is that misinformation and disinformation, and it seems most of that is coming from social media. So you hinted to it, but I'm hoping you can elaborate. What role does Canadian journalism play in countering that threat? How important is that, and how can Parliament better support our own journalism as a trusted source of information so people aren't solely relying on social media?
Okay, so I think when it comes to the role of journalists, one of the risks that we see is as some things like investigative reporting, things that really help to educate the voter, are being not heavily resourced or not really resourced at all. It ends up being that people are absorbing information that might give them some facts, but doesn't necessarily give them the kind of background, the education, the analysis that helps them actually then become more informed citizens in all kinds of ways, better critical readers, better critical thinkers. That's what we want, right? Like, we don't just want for people to be able to say, yeah, I trust that journalist, so I'll just read what they write and then I'm good, because that creates another problem in that then you've got a lot of people who are just sort of honing in on their own echo chambers. People aren't all absorbing the same kind of broad pieces of information. And so then you get more of that polarization. Like, there's a relationship between, and I'm being really oversimplifying here, but there's a relationship between that disinformation and the polarization, where people aren't checking their own assumptions against a broader piece because they don't have to. Because you can read all day and you're still only being subject to a very narrow range of ideas. And so as far as journalists are concerned, I mean, sometimes one thing I don't like is this tendency sometimes towards what we call fact-checking, where as soon as you go down that road, then there's going to be someone who puts up their hand and says, well, no, that's not right. And there's kind of I think sometimes a misuse of that space, and I don't know that that's necessarily the right way to do it. That said, I think it's important to do something to kind of get those facts out there, separate out from opinion writing and just kind of fact-based reporting where this is it, make up your own mind. I think it would be great to see more resources. Again, I understand the provincial jurisdiction over education, but it would be wonderful to see more resources toward programs that will, maybe it's online journalism, maybe it's more print journalism, but things that help to build up people's civic awareness.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Madame Bria.
Bonjour à vous deux et merci.
Yes, good afternoon to both of you, and thank you for being here. Professor Turnbull, under the law, there are protections against misleading publications, undue foreign interference, as well as mis or fake information. Now, there are nevertheless activities of that kind here. Would it be judicious to extend these protections to activities that the purpose of which is to disrupt our elections, but maybe come from outside Canada?
So I definitely worry about foreign interference. I think it's difficult for us to regulate what kinds of outside information and information, misinformation, disinformation, what kind of flow of content is coming into the country. It's hard for us to do that. And it's hard and in many ways that runs the risk of being way too heavy and undesirable for other reasons too. I know I'm repeating myself, but I really think the best way is for people to be able to be informed on their own and to develop those critical skills so that even if something looks sophisticated, they know the different ways to double and triple check it to make sure that they're not being fooled. There's no substitute for that. And anything government does, there should be accountability if people are, in other ways too, right? Like if people are deliberately trying to create instability and disruption in a conversation about who's going to be elected, that there needs to be accountability for that. But there are limits to how much the government can do when you really need citizens to be able to recognize mis and disinformation themselves.
Est-ce que vous pensez que la loi électorale...
Do you think that Canada's Election Act, in its current format, opens the door to foreign interference? And why, if and how?
I don't see the current election law as full of gaps and holes that foreign actors who have hostile intent would look at it and say, oh, that's a particularly vulnerable election law. I don't feel that way. I think that foreign interference, unfortunately, is a way of life. not just for Canada, but other democracies too. And different democracies are taking different approaches to how to manage that. Sometimes it's through law, sometimes it's through something like you create some sort of a commissioner of, some office that's dedicated to raising awareness about foreign interference, raising awareness about different foreign campaigns that could affect our elections. But even, as I think about it, when we think about things like foreign interference, foreign intrusion, foreign, influence, like there's all different kinds of, there's a spectrum of ways in which foreign actors might try to influence the conversation. Not all of them are they're not all equally problematic. Like the ones that we have to worry about are the ones that are clandestine. They're hidden in ways that people are not supposed to really see that this is an effort at trying to change the electoral conversation or mislead people. Whereas I think we could all point to examples of political actors in other countries who would love to have effect on how our politics are being practiced, but it's not the same type of thing because they're saying it out loud.
I'd like to thank the witnesses. We've been through 2 full rounds of questioning, so I look to the committee to adjourn. Seeing nods, we're adjourned.